You're telling me they ate the emergency rations? The ones marked non-edible for every species in the coalition? Captain Dreel's quills bristled as he stared at his communications officer. The young Cathian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, mandibles twitching. Yes, sir, and they're asking if there's more. The bridge of the VX Edge fell into silence. Every crew member in earshot, from the Kritin navigator to the bulbous floating Sixian engineer, exchanged uncertain glances. The humans had only been aboard for 2 rotations, but already they had managed to unsettle the entire crew. Dreel exhaled slowly. Explain. In detail. The Cathian officer cleared his throat. As you know, sir, standard coalition rations are synthesized from bio-neutral compounds to ensure universal digestibility. However, due to chemical instability, the emergency rations were deemed hazardous for biological consumption. He hesitated. The human contingent didn't seem to care. They consumed an entire crate of them and reportedly claimed they weren't bad. Dreel pinched the bridge of his snout. And they're unharmed? Worse, sir, they're energized. One of them even suggested stocking more for spontaneous snacks. A heavy thud echoed through the bridge as the Kritin navigator slumped against his console. By the Great Void. How is that possible? Those rations contain compounds that would corrode organic tissue. Even a scion would need to filter out the toxicity. Dreel stood and adjusted his uniform. We need to speak to them. Now. The humans were gathered in their designated mess hall, sharing stories over yet another round of questionable food choices. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with short brown hair and a casual stance, grinned as he bit into what should have been a corrosive protein bar. Tastes kinda like old peanut butter, he said between bites. Bit of a chemical aftertaste, but I've had worse. The others nodded in agreement. A wiry man with sharp eyes pointed at the remaining bars. Think we can toast these? Maybe melt them into a stew? Captain Dreel entered, followed by a few officers, their expressions caught between confusion and alarm. He wasted no time. Explain, he demanded, gesturing to the empty wrappers strewn across the table. Those rations were deemed hazardous to every biological species in the coalition. How are you still functional? The broad-shouldered human looked at his companions, shrugged, then turned back to the captain. Oh, you mean these? Well, we grew up eating all sorts of stuff. Processed food, synthetic proteins, freeze-dried meals. Trust me, whatever's in these doesn't come close to some of the junk we've eaten back home. Dreel narrowed his eyes. But they should be toxic. The wiry human grinned. Define toxic. If it won't kill us immediately, we usually figure something out. The Sixian engineer floated closer, his translucent body shifting with agitation. This is absurd. These compounds were classified as indigestible. Some of them have a molecular structure resistant to enzymatic breakdown. The broad-shouldered human tilted his head. Yeah, we got an enzyme for that. The room fell silent. Dreel exhaled through his gills. You have an enzyme for it? The human nodded. More like a whole digestive system that just figures things out. Kind of like a personal biohazard disposal unit. You wouldn't believe the stuff we used to eat back in training. Half the time, we didn't even know what was in it. Dreel could feel a headache forming. And yet you remain unharmed? More or less. Sometimes there's consequences, but nothing major. The Kritin navigator hissed. This is why your species is terrifying. The broad-shouldered human laughed. Wait till you hear about hot sauce. The briefing room was filled with senior coalition officers, all staring at the screen displaying a breakdown of human dietary resilience. At the centre, Darfall gestured to the analysis gathered from the ship's medical scanners. These results indicate that humans possess an adaptive digestive system capable of metabolizing an unprecedented range of organic and inorganic materials. Their stomach acids rival industrial solvents, and their metabolic processes neutralize a variety of hazardous compounds. A Xan delegate clicked his mandibles. How did such an anomaly evolve? Dreel turned to the medical officer, who hesitated before responding. Humans originated on a high variability world where survival often depended on consuming whatever was available. Their biological adaptability allowed them to process a wide range of substances. As a result, their diet includes items classified as hazardous by most other species. A heavy silence followed. Then a voice muttered, "This explains the coffee incident." Dreel groaned. Yes, that was another problem when the human engineer requested a stronger stimulant. We provided him with a synthetic compound typically used for emergency resuscitation. He drank it, declared it good stuff, and asked for a second cup. A collective shudder rippled through the room. The Krillin ambassador leaned forward. "Are we certain they are biological?" Dreel sighed. "I have checked their medical scans multiple times. They are, by all definitions, organic. They just have an abnormal threshold for consumption." Another delegate, a Sixian representative, floated closer. "Should we be concerned?" Dreel hesitated. "Let me put it this way. If they ever run out of food, they will find a way." The room remained silent as the weight of that realization settled over them. It was one thing to face an enemy with superior firepower. It was another to face one that could survive on nearly anything, anywhere. The alien delegation sat in uneasy silence as the implications of the report settled over them. Dorfall folded his arms, his quills pressing tightly against his back. The Sixian representative was the first to break the silence. "Captain, we must assess whether this adaptability presents a strategic threat to the Coalition. If humans can survive nearly any environment and consume anything, their potential for expansion is concerning." "Finished," the Kritin ambassador added, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "If they can subsist on food sources completely inedible to the rest of us, then their logistical needs are minimal compared to our own." Drek'Val exhaled slowly. "I understand your concerns, but we must also consider the advantages. Humans are proving to be unparalleled in emergency situations. The crew of VX Edge has already benefited from their resilience." He paused, "including the recent containment failure." A shudder rippled through the room. Every species present had strict protocols regarding containment failures. If biohazard materials leaked, standard procedure was to seal the affected areas and initiate purging cycles. But the humans? They had different methods. The Exan delegate's mandibles twitched. "Are you referring to the fuel line rupture?" "Yes," Dreel said. "Our engineering team had assessed the leak and determined that exposure to the hyperreactive compounds in the air filtration ducts would be lethal." He gestured at the display screen, which showed security footage from the event. The alien officers watched as the human crew members inspected the damage, then, without protective gear, began sealing the leak manually. They ignored the warnings, patched the leak, and proceeded to carry on as if nothing had happened. The Kritin ambassador's gills flared. "That compound should have caused cellular breakdown. How did they withstand it?" Dreel shifted uncomfortably. "According to our medical team, they suffered minor symptoms, irritation, dizziness. One reported an upset stomach, but within an hour they were fully operational again." A Sixian technician spoke up, his translucent form pulsating. "Captain, if humans can survive exposure to hazardous materials, consume nearly anything, and adapt to extreme conditions, then we must reconsider their classification within the Coalition." His multiple eyes glistened. "These are not standard biological traits. They are exceptional." Dreel steepled his claws. "That is precisely what concerns me. We have long believed the most adaptable species in the Coalition were the Kritin and Chians. Yet humans, they do not just adapt, they redefine their limitations." Later that day, Drial found himself in the human mess hall once again. He observed from the doorway as the human contingent gathered around a steaming pot of something that smelled oddly enticing. One of them, the wiry engineer who had suggested melting the emergency rations, gave the pot a stir. "All right, boys, we're making history here," he said, grinning. "Coalition Mystery Stew." The broad-shouldered human from before, Johnson, Drekval recalled, laughed. "What's in it?" "A little bit of everything. Some standard rations, some of that Critin protein paste, a dash of the Sixian nutrient compound, and—" he paused dramatically. "Just a hint of that emergency ration we had earlier." Johnson shook his head. "That's either genius or reckless. Probably both." Driel stepped forward. "You do realize that consuming that combination could be hazardous?" The humans looked at him, then at each other, before bursting into laughter. The engineer wiped a tear from his eye. "Captain, we grew up eating questionable food. Ever heard of instant ramen?" He gestured to the pot. "This is just another experiment." Driel hesitated, then watched as each human took a serving. They slurped, chewed, and then— nothing. No convulsions, no immediate reactions. "Not bad," Johnson said. "Bit of an aftertaste." Though Driel sat heavily in a nearby chair. "I do not understand you." The engineer grinned. "That's the fun part." He slid a bowl toward the captain. "Want to try?" Driel looked at the steaming concoction, then at the expectant faces of the humans. He hesitated, then cautiously took a sip. It was surprisingly acceptable, and that terrified him. Driel wasn't sure which was worse, that he had eaten the human-made stew and survived, or that he had enjoyed it. The knowledge gnawed at him as he sat in the debriefing chamber, staring at the latest analysis of human physiology. "We have been attempting to categorize them within coalition biological frameworks," the Sixian scientist droned, his translucent body undulating slightly. "But every classification we apply becomes obsolete within days. Their metabolism alone operates on principles that defy known patterns of adaptation." "Explain," Drefall said, rubbing his snout in exhaustion. "Consider their digestive resilience. They should not be able to consume half of what they do, and yet they thrive on substances other species classify as toxic. Their bodies neutralize hazards at an alarming rate, and their ability to adjust to environmental stresses is unprecedented." The scientist hesitated. "Captain, they may be immune to biological warfare." The room fell silent. The Xian delegate clicked his mandibles. "You are suggesting that, in the event of conflict, our most devastating weapons would be useless." "Not entirely useless," the scientist admitted, "but certainly less effective. We have tested multiple contaminants, and while humans experience discomfort, they rapidly recover. Their immune response is highly aggressive, and their adaptability extends beyond what we anticipated." Driel leaned forward. "And their psychology?" The scientist hesitated again. "We have observed a pattern. They do not simply endure hardship, they embrace it. When placed in unfamiliar or dangerous circumstances, they do not retreat. They experiment. Their response to adverse conditions is not to avoid, but to engage," the Krillin ambassador hissed. "That is not a survival trait. That is reckless." "And yet it works," Driel murmured. He had seen it firsthand, when they ate the emergency rations, when they patched the fuel leak, when they turned their own mess hall into an ongoing culinary experiment. The humans refused to be categorized, refused to be constrained by expectations. "There is one final matter to discuss," the scientist continued. "Given these findings, we must determine the role of humanity within the coalition. We have long assigned species to specific classifications: scientists, warriors, engineers. But humans do not fit neatly into any of these." Driel exhaled. "Because they are all of them." The room fell silent again. The implications were clear. Humans were not specialists. They were survivors, endlessly adaptable, capable of thriving in conditions that would break other species. They would not dominate through strength or technology, but through sheer, unrelenting persistence. "We should be cautious," the Xi'an delegate said at last. "They may be allies now, but what happens if their ambitions grow? What if they begin to expand beyond what we can accommodate?" Dreel tapped his claws against the table. "I have spent weeks among them. I have seen what they are capable of. Their strength is not in conquest, but in cooperation. They do not seek to consume worlds. They seek to belong to them. They do not fear the unknown. They chase it." The Kritin ambassador's gills twitched. "And if they ever turn against us, Dreel, then we will have to pray that we are worth keeping as friends." Later that evening, he found himself once again in the human mess hall. The humans were gathered around another steaming pot of questionable contents, laughing and joking, as they prepared yet another bizarre concoction. Johnson grinned as he saw him approach. "Captain, back for round 2? Dreel hesitated, then sat down. "I suppose I must embrace my own curiosity." The humans cheered as they handed him a bowl. As he took the first bite, he realized something. Perhaps humanity's greatest strength wasn't just their ability to survive. It was their ability to share survival with everyone else. The Coalition had seen many species rise and fall, but none had ever forced them to reconsider the very nature of survival itself. Humanity had not only endured within the Coalition, they had thrived, embedding themselves into every aspect of interstellar life. No longer seen as newcomers, they had become an irreplaceable part of the galactic fabric. Years after Dreel's initial encounters, he sat on the bridge of the VX Edge, watching as a human-led expedition prepared to land on a newly discovered planet. The surface was volatile, filled with toxic storms and uncharted dangers. It was, by all Coalition standards, uninhabitable, yet the humans were already discussing settlement plans. Not with hesitation, but with excitement. A human officer turned to Dreel with a grin. "Captain, want to see if we can cook something up from the local flora?" Dreel exhaled and shook his head, a small smile creeping across his face. "I wouldn't expect anything less. The galaxy would never be the same."